It is a great delight to be with you this morning, to be here in this place to worship, to put aside all the cares out there and come into this place and turn our attention upon Jesus Christ the Lord and to consider him, to give praise unto him, to honor him. I don't know what your week was like this week. I had a good week. But no matter what your week was like, I know that it is good to come into the sanctuary of the Lord and to listen now for the voice of the Lord to speak to us from his word, which I would invite you to turn then within to the letter of 1 John. Working our way through this little epistle of the last apostle of the New Testament era. As John is writing in this little letter about something that he considers very profound, something that he has probably been considering for a very long time, given his advanced age and the experiences that he's had himself, this word of life that he introduces right at the very beginning of the letter, a powerful new life spoken by the Father into those who belong to Christ Jesus, a life that is eternal in nature because it's been with the Father from the very beginning. Yet it appears in our lives in very tangible ways. It comes in very real ways in our existence. And this life is at the center of all of our Christian fellowship, one with another and with him, making our life one of complete joy. That's the essence of the thesis of this letter. It's truly living life. Not just the Christian life. Truly living life as those who belong to Christ. And we have in this letter then two great ontological statements about the very nature of God himself. And we've started with the first, which is God is light, which is the subject of chapters 1 and 2, that God is holy and pure, that there is that he is the fullness of grace and majesty. He is light. John, I imagine, suffers for a word to describe God, so he uses this phrase, God is light. And this life then is from the very nature of God himself as holy that is permeating us. And there are certain implications to that. We must pursue after holiness. We must respond to the continuing sin in our lives by hating it. We must look for the advocate that we have in Christ, and we must obey his commandments. See that at the middle of chapter 2, right, verse 3. This we know, by this we know that we have come to know him. By this we know that we have come to know who this Jesus is, by keeping his commandments. All right, that becomes the focal message through the rest of the chapter. Obeying his commandments. Now, when we think of commandments, of course, as we've said a couple of weeks, but review is important. We have some people who haven't heard this, so, okay. There are three different ways to understand this word commandments. The first and the most obvious is, well, just the Decalogue, the 10 commandments that Moses gave. I read you Deuteronomy 9 this morning, where he apparently came down from the mountain with those tablets of stone written by the finger of God with the commandments on them. Okay, that's the easiest way to understand the commandments. It's the simplest way, but that's not where John is thinking. Because he knows that there's a level higher than that, and that's the spirit of that law, which is that sense that Jesus gives to us in the Sermon on the Mount, that sense in which not only is there a jot and tittle to the law, but there's also a spirit to that law that rises above just keeping the details of the law. But John knows that there is even a higher level than that. An even higher level that belongs to all of us who have been given this word of life. It's dare I say, a higher plane of existence. It's a higher level than just keeping the spirit of the law, as though our entire focus is on law rather than on what he has given to us in this word of life. Yes, the minimum standard for the Christian is to keep the law. The minimum standard for all of humanity is to keep the law. The minimum standard for the Christian is to at least keep that spirit of the law. But there is something more than just trying to live out our lives keeping some sort of moral standard. There's a higher standard, the highest standard that's expected of all of us, which comes to the singular use of that word then in verses 7 and 8 of chapter 2. It's the commandment. What John says is it's not a new commandment, and yet at the same time it is a new commandment. It's an old commandment because it's always been there. If this word of life that God has given out to all of those who follow him comes from him, then by definition it is an ancient commandment. It comes from the very nature of God himself. But yet at the same time it's also a new commandment. It's a new thing that's come to us in this word of life. It's new in the sense that it's more than what is expected of just the average Christian. It's new in the sense that it's being refreshed to us in the person of Jesus Christ. And that newness is to make every aspect of our existence conform to the image of Christ himself. Not just the moral nature, not just the choices of, doing wrong or not doing wrong. That's a minimum. But it's much higher than that. It's about all of our existence. It's about all of our life. And so John is trying to get across this idea that the Christian doesn't just live under some sort of set of rules and standards or even the spirit of those standards. He lives on a higher plane, a level way above that. As Paul says, that we've been set free from the law to live in a higher standard of living in the Spirit. This commandment, as we looked at last week, you remember, permeates Jesus himself. Notice it says it's true in him. It's true in him. This idea of living out the commandment, this higher level, permeates Jesus because Jesus lived out his Father's word of life in every thought, every emotion, every moral choice, every non-moral choice, and every word that he spoke throughout the course of his life. He was sinless. He was sinless far more than just avoiding temptation. His life wasn't just about going around avoiding temptation. His obedience was what permeated every aspect of the Imago Dei in him. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a second. And John then says, and this is also true in you. See, it's true in him, but it's also true in you. If you are a follower of Christ, if you are a believer by trusting in Christ by faith, then this commandment must permeate you. Believers are also called to live out this word of life in every aspect of their lives. It's not just about you and I keeping from temptation. That's the least that we do. What we do is we live out this word of life in every part of our daily existence, because every aspect of our lives must flow through a biblical worldview, a gospel-centered worldview. But there is an additional aspect to the obedience of Christ that must permeate us. We're going to go even one step higher than this, my friends. And this commandment is new even over our natural state. Look at verse 9. Let me read verse 8 as I swing into verse 9 here. Verse 8, at the same time it is a new commandment that I'm writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. These verses are extraordinary. May not look so immediately, but let me show you how they are extraordinary. It is a new commandment, as I just said, over our natural state. All right, so let's examine these verses by noting that you will see the repetition of three words in it. In the three verses that I read, 9, 10, and 11, you see the repetition of three words or concepts. All right, the first is the word brother. The second is the word hate, or its complement, the word love. So hate or love. And the third is the word light. or darkness, its complement. Okay, so you see three different concepts that appear side by side, and you'll notice how repetitive John is in the three verses in putting those three words, those three concepts together. So a good expositor at this point is going to stop and exposit, I should say, those three words. All right, so let's start with the word light. This should be the easiest one because we've dealt with it throughout the entirety of this book. Light has been the subject from the very beginning of this letter. Light is the idea of the nature of God himself, expressed in his eternal word of life. Right? I gave you that summary just a moment ago. The light is the very nature of God himself, expressed in his eternal word of life, now manifest in and to be lived out in the believer. In the simplest way, we might call light holiness, we might call darkness rebellion. The two mirror ideas to one another we've seen throughout this book. Light is contrasted with darkness here. Darkness meaning the world of sin and death and rebellion. We call it the lack of light. So you have this idea of God's nature on the one side, holy and pure. Darkness, the rebellion and hatred and sin on the other side. Okay, so it's a clear dichotomy that we've already seen. In this case, then, what John is doing, as he has done throughout the letter all along, is make a contrast between those who are in or abide in or walk in this light versus those who continue to live in a world of sin and rebellion. Okay? In other words, the entirety of this letter so far. So this is nothing new when it comes to this word light. We shouldn't have to say, what's he mean here? He's been using this word all along. So he's clearly referring to something that comes from the Father that reveals his holiness, his nature as God versus a world filled with sin and darkness and rebellion. Okay. All right. So that one's the easy one. So let's move to the second one, and that's the word brother. The word brother here is a word in the Greek, eldaphos. We get our word delphos from it. All right. The city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, okay, that's the brother. It's a term of connection, okay? It's a term of connection, but it's a word that has a wide semantic domain, meaning it can be used in many different ways. You can take this word brother and use it in so many different ways in the scriptures. So the natural question we have to ask is, how is John using this word here? When he says brother, what's he referring to, all right? So the simplest definition of this word brother, the immediate sense of the word, is a literal brother, a sibling, okay, a male sibling, a brother in one's nuclear family. Now, just to pause here and note something. John chooses to use the masculine form of the noun here because in Greek, all nouns possess either a masculine or feminine form, depending on the suffix, okay? There are neuter nouns as well, but generally speaking, most are male or female. All right. He chooses in this case to use the masculine form. It's highly likely that the term is being used, however, to denote either gender in its application. It's highly unlikely that John is simply referring to men only in the course of the letter. It's most likely that he's using it to refer in either gender. In other words, since John had to choose a gender for the word, his custom would be to use a male form. But that does not need to imply that he intended to speak only about or to the male readers of his letter, okay? Now, in other cases, biblical writers are going to choose masculine forms because they want to make a point with a masculine form. But in this case, it seems from the context that John isn't necessarily just limiting his discussion to men. Now, the immediate sense is this idea of a literal brother, someone who you grew up with in your house. I had the opportunity to meet a brother today. Okay, so it makes sense. However, it would seem highly unlikely contextually here that John is only referring to literal siblings. Highly unlikely. Logically, the issue of people hating their literal siblings is rather rare. Very few of you are walking around literally hating the siblings of your household. Now, there may be a few of you, but that's highly unlikely, right? I mean, we typically may not really like our sibling, especially if he's the older, better-looking one. But That doesn't mean we hate them, okay? So it's unlikely that John is trying to deal with some sort of new issue in the human race of men walking around hating their literal siblings, right? That's highly unlikely. It's clear, I think, that John is addressing grander realities than just one's connection to their nuclear family, okay? So I think we can pass by the immediate sense and go to a much more broader sense, in which case we're talking here about the members, the word brother being used, as members of the larger family to which one belongs by a common connection, such as ethnicity or religion or class. A brother in this case would be a fellow Jew, for example, or a fellow Greek, or a fellow Italian, or whatever group you belong to. A brother in the sense of I have something in common with somebody out there because of some commonality of connection, ethnically speaking, or religiously, or class-wise. Now, this term is often used in the New Testament, in this form amongst New Testament writers. Brothers is often used as reference to other believers. Okay, I have a connection to other believers because we have something in common. What do we have in common? We have faith in Christ, common with one another. So this term is often used in this way, in that sense, having a connection with other believers in the family of God. In fact, in Paul's letters, not John, but in Paul's letters, he uses this term to describe fellow believers in every single one of his letters except Titus. At least once. In every single one of his letters, he uses the term brothers, probably in that generic gender sense, to mean those of us who belong to a common faith, belong to the church. Okay, so brothers in this case. But again, probably here, based on the context, it seems highly unlikely that John is only referring to the relationship that believers would have to other believers. I mean, listen to how, let me read just a verse of this again, verse 11. But whoever hates, and we substitute in here, whoever hates his fellow Christian is in the darkness and walks in the darkness. That's kind of odd, isn't it? That seems like bizarre language. It seems rather strange that John would be concerned about the real issue of Christians hating Christians in the church. It's like, is that really a problem? Is that really an issue? Yeah, again, I know you might look around the room and go, I hate that guy. But it's not likely that's the real issue, right? The hate of Christians for other Christians is probably not what he's referring to. He's probably not referring to that commonality that we might have, as though the primary problem was believers walking around despising fellow believers. Now, that particular interpretation is not out of context here. It's very possible that John could be, in a sense, thinking of that in terms of our relationships to one another in the church, that sometimes, yes, we act as though we hate one another, but it's not likely that John is saying the real problem that we have in terms of this walk with life is that all of you Christians are walking around despising one another. That doesn't make much sense. So it's much more likely that John is using this term in its broadest sense. And the broadest sense here is simply the word brothers referring to the entirety of the human race. The entirety of the human race. So the brotherhood that we have by virtue of being included in the family of humanity. The common connection in this case then is what we have with all other people by virtue of all of us being included in the human race and possessing the Imago Dei. All of us being included in this thing called humanity, right? A similar usage is found in another word that's somewhat synonymous to it. And when I use this word, you'll know what I mean. And that word is the word neighbor, right? Doesn't it say somewhere in Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself? Okay, so let me ask you a question. Is Jesus referring to your love for the person across the fence line from you only? Of course not. He's referring to all other people, right? Neighbor is a generic term for all of humanity. It's certainly not a reference to just the guy that lives on the other side of the fence and has a few chickens. It's the guy living on the other side of you too, and then the guy across the street over there, and then the guy on the other side of town, and then the guy on the other side of the world. Neighbor, Jesus certainly wasn't using to describe just a literal neighbor. So the idea, I think, is the same here, that John is simply using the term brother as a reference to everyone else who is a part of our lives, either by intimate connection, meaning a sibling or a fellow Christian, or by the general connection of simply being another human being made in the image of God. If you walk around hating your brother, meaning another person, other people, whether that be a singular person or other people in general, is probably how he's referring to it. Or we could say it like this. John is making an application of his assertion regarding the new commandment to how we, as those who say we are in the light, relate to those around us. Okay, I think that's where he's going. He is saying here, listen, if you say that you're in the light and hate other people, you are still in darkness. He's not referring to hating your sibling. He's certainly not referring to hating other Christians, although that could be included in this picture. But he's referring to the general connection, I think, that we would have with other human beings. So this term brother is probably simply a word being used to describe how we are connected to all other human beings. Which leads us then to the third term, which is the word hate, and its corollary, love. This word hate here is a strong word. It is a word used meaning to despise another, to detest. Literally, it means to see others with contempt. Or it means to love less. To love less. Now, again, I think John is probably using the term hyperbolically here, meaning he's using a strong word to produce a reaction. It's a shock and awe kind of word that he's using here, okay? He's very few people, frankly, literally hate other people. I mean, that's pretty rare. I mean, there might be somebody in your life that you just like, I hate that guy, but there's probably very few of those, right? I mean, very few human beings really walk around with a literal hate towards others, unless you're part of some ethnic group that really hates another ethnic group, like we have all over the Middle East, and we can't figure out why we can't produce peace because that hate is so in-depth in the hearts of the people there. But that's a different story. But it's a word, I think, that John is using hyperbolically. He's trying to use a word to shock, to describe something that needs to be viewed in the right way. He's making a strong contrast here. I'll give you an example of this. Jesus does this in Luke chapter 14, verse 26, when he says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Notice the word, hate. Now, do you really think that Jesus was standing in front of his disciples and say, look, you want to be my disciple, you have to start hating your mom and your dad and your brothers and your sisters and everybody else. You literally have to hate them. No, of course not, because Jesus would be reminded of the fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. Okay, so certainly Jesus is not saying here that to come to Jesus, you have to start walking around with a hatred in your soul for your parents. That's clearly not what he means. It's using a word hyperbolically to make a point. The priority of Christ over family must be so stark that the contrasting importance of family must pale into insignificance. In other words, our love for Christ must be so great that the love that we therefore have for our parents and continue to have for our parents pales into insignificance, comparatively speaking. So I think that's what John is doing here. He's using the word hatred to produce a contrast here. He wants you to see the contrast. And he's using the word as a mirror of the way that Jesus did. A focus so much on the self that the corresponding priority of others appears as a form of hatred towards them. Okay, let me say that again. He's using the word hate in relationship to a brother here to describe a focus so much on the self, an inward focus on oneself, that the corresponding priority of others appears as a form of hatred towards others. A love of yourself so great that it makes it look like your relationship to others is pure hatred. That's where he's going. He's using hyperbolic language to describe how we relate to other people. Remember, this isn't just the discussion of siblings or even fellow believers, but a relationship to humanity, to those around us that we have some connection to. And it becomes a focus, a word focused on the self, such that our love for ourselves is so great that our relationship to others looks like we hate them. Hate, then, here is defined, I think, as an utter narcissism. Now, you remember that word comes from the Greek god Narcissus, who was a very handsome man, and he saw himself in a pool of water and fell in love with himself to the point that he died because he looked at himself only. Narcissism, self-love. It's a form of narcissism that makes one so self-focused and self-centered that he or she appears as unloving and uncaring beyond themselves. That their self-love is so much focused upon themselves that it appears to others, they appear to others as being unloving and uncaring. So where's John going? What's his intention in using this language? What is he describing here? And I think what he's describing here is the common condition of man. The common condition of man. Agree or disagree with the following statement. Humanity is utterly narcissistic. It is, isn't it? Why? Because we have been cursed into this by the fall. We have become self-lovers to the extreme because of the fall of Adam. You have to teach a 2-year-old to share, don't you? I have a 2-year-old grandson. My 2-year-old grandson believes that everything in the world belongs to him, especially if it's in the hands of his older sister. And he will literally pitch a fit, throw himself on the floor and throw a tantrum if she possesses something that he cannot have. It's not his, it's hers, but boy, if he wants it, now. Right? We have to teach a 2-year-old to share because we are born into this world as little narcissists. Now, I would just pause for a moment here and put this over against the evolutionary idea of survival. The evolutionists would have you to believe that the reason we are utterly selfish is because this is how we survive, right? That we need to take a hold of other things in order to survive. That's the evolutionary response that we would have. But it's interesting that our narcissism extends beyond the things that we need to many things we don't. We become utterly narcissistic about things that we really don't need, right? I mean, do I really need the latest one of these little gadgets? How many of you have found yourself just obsessing over, some of you are not making eye contact at this moment. How many of you have found yourself obsessing over wanting to have the latest one of these? And you just can't live without it. Right? You don't need this to survive. Yeah, I know you're saying, yes, I do. I gotta have this. I have to check this first thing in the morning when I get out of bed because I can't even get out of bed without making sure that I haven't missed a text from somebody. You know? I mean, what if the president texted me during the night? Come on! Yeah, exactly. Delete it. No, I'd reply to it. Yeah. We don't have an evolutionary survival instinct. We have a narcissism in us. We have a desire for things and a self-love for ourselves. Now, let me just point out that the evidence of this self-focus and self-centeredness are clearly on display in Genesis chapter 3. Now, you know me, I'm always in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Because it seems to me that I learn something new about these 3 chapters every time I open them. Okay, think about this for a second. The evidences of self-focus and self-centeredness are clearly on display. Eve, it tells us in the text, after the devil tempts her, she looks at the tree and she sees that the goodness of the fruit. She sees the goodness of the fruit. To the eye, it says, that it looks good to her. What is that? That is a desire. She sees the desire. She looks at the fruit and it looks good and she desires to have it. And then secondly, it says that she desires to be wise. She desires what the devil said she would have, right? Eat from the tree, you will know the difference between evil and good, right? The knowledge of good, okay. She wants that. She desires for that wisdom to come to her. She was, in the work of the devil, turned from a focus on the goodness of God to something she wanted outside of him for herself. See it? She had a focus on God because there was God walking and talking with her and her husband in the garden every day for as long as they were in that garden, until that time came when suddenly something else came along that suddenly looked better to her, and she desired it. A self-focus came into play. And we know that Adam was also consumed with a self-focus, and he took his eye off the ball. We were talking about this on Sunday night in our masculine Christianity discussion about Adam as the federal head of a race. Adam forgot about his intimate connection to the Lord, and he disregarded the mandate given to him as he watched and listened to the serpent. Now, chapter 3 of verse 6 tells us that Adam was there while this was taking place. He forgot about something, or he took his eyes off of something. He had been told by God, be fruitful and multiply and take dominion over everything. And God went on even after that in chapter 1 to describe what is to take dominion over. Animals, birds of the air, fish, creeping things. And there's an interesting parallel in Genesis 3:1 where the serpent is described as crafty, which is a word in the Hebrew that can mean creeping thing. Adam was given a mandate by God. This world is yours. I'm giving it to you. I'm giving you dominion over this world. I created it, yes. But I'm giving to you, Adam, the authority to take dominion over everything that is there. Take dominion over every living thing. Adam was designated by God to be the patriarch of the entire human race. That word patriarch, by the way, I know it's an ugly word in our society today, but it's fully biblical. It's a word that means father rule. Okay? It simply means father rule. It doesn't mean dictator rule. It means father rule. A patriarchy is a father rule where a father lovingly rules and guides and directs his world. Adam was required to be the patriarch. He was the father. He was to do what? Be fruitful and multiply. That's what fathers do, right? He was to be fruitful and multiply, to be the father. He was the patriarch, the ruling father, the federal head of the entire human race. As he would, so would all humanity after him go. He was the representative of the race. He was the one that God had said, you, Adam, you take dominion, and all of your progeny will follow after you. Adam was to continually relate to his Creator and take dominion over everything God had created. And listen to me, including that ancient serpent. Adam was supposed to take dominion over everything in this world. As long as Adam did what he was supposed to do, his progeny would live in perfect harmony with God and reign over what God had created. Hard to imagine that now, isn't it? But as Adam would go, so would go the race. The primeval sin was not Eve eating from the tree. Oh, I know we always point there, right? No. Listen. The primeval sin was Adam failing to interpose himself between his wife and that serpent. Adam should have walked in between his wife and the serpent and looked the serpent in the face and said, you will not do an end run around me, pal. And you will not attack my wife. No, you're going to deal with me. And I'm going to deal with you like this. I'm going to grab you by the neck and throw you out of this garden because God has given me the authority over you to do so. But he did not. He allowed his wife to be tempted to her fall and his. Her self-focus became his self-focus. Who should he have been focusing on? His wife. Who should his primary concern have been in that moment? Eve. But he did not. He stood there and he watched and he listened while his wife was tempted, and her focus was shifted, and so was his. And she handed him some fruit, and he ate it. Thus, the self-focus of our primeval parents of listening to the devil was hardened into the human reality of utter narcissism. And there's an interesting little statement at the beginning of Genesis chapter 5. If you've never read Genesis chapter 5, I know you avoid it because it's full of names. Don't read the first few verses of it. In the first two verses, the writer recapitulates the idea of Adam and Eve being made in the image of God. And then in verse 3, it says, and Adam had a son in his own image. What image is that? That's the image of sin. That's the image of utter narcissism that he had that flowed into his progeny. Look, you only need to turn the page into the very next chapter, Genesis chapter 4, to see it. Who's the most self-focused person that's ever lived? Well, I would argue it's Cain. He stands before God and says, look at all this good stuff that I grew out of the ground. And God says, sorry, I don't want that. And Cain becomes, what? What do you mean? My sacrifice should be accepted. It doesn't matter whether it's a blood sacrifice or not. And it certainly doesn't matter, I know that you told us that that's what we're supposed to do because you showed it to Adam and Eve by killing animals and putting the skins on. I know all that, but I want you to accept my sacrifice. Let me suggest to you that that is the nature of all religion that exists on this planet. You must take what I have done. And God says, oh, no. And what does Cain do? He kills his brother. But then, When God comes to him and curses him to wander the earth, what's his first reaction? He whines. Somebody's going to kill me. Utter narcissism on display. This is what has happened to the human race. We have become, by virtue of the fall, utterly self-focused and in love with ourselves. So in these verses here, what John is doing, very simply, is contrasting those who hate others because of their own self-focus, meaning their love for themselves is so great it looks as though they hate others, with those who love others because of an other-centeredness. Those who are in the darkness, what are they doing? They're loving themselves. They're loving their own needs. They're loving their own passions and desires. The one in the light has an other-centeredness. Now, let me connect that to Jesus for you. Okay? Remember, as I said at the outset of this sermon, and what we saw last week was, we discussed, you remember, the fullness of Jesus' obedience. Remember, I said that Jesus' obedience went way beyond just the moral temptations that he dealt with every day. The obedience of Jesus is more than just him not falling to the devil's temptations in Matthew 4. Much, much more than that. As I said, every thought that Jesus thought in his head was holy and pure. Every emotion that he felt in regards to a circumstance, how he reacted, was holy and pure. Every decision that he made, whether it was a moral choice, like a temptation, or a simple day-to-day choice of what to wear or where to go, Jesus made holy and pure choices. And even every word that came out of his mouth, every word he spoke was holy and pure. Jesus' obedience wasn't just limited to a few moral temptations that he had to deal with. The entirety of his existence, every aspect of the Imago Dei in him was filled with holy and purity. Let me just add one to that, if I could. In Jesus' imagination, did Jesus have an imagination? Sure he did. How do we know? He told wonderful stories, didn't he? He imagined, right? A farmer casting seed out, and he imagined trees with birds in it, and he had images in his mind, right? We all have imaginations, right? We can imagine fictional characters in our minds or fictional situations in our minds, right? We can even go so far as to fantasize about being in different places and, being on Mars. Then we can make movies with people on Mars, and we can have imagination, right? Jesus had an imagination, and he had a healthy imagination, but Jesus never imagined or fantasized about that which is sinful or impure. How many of you can say that? No, we can't say that, can we? No, we have very often fantasized about taking a brick and hitting somebody with it. Okay, maybe that's not your fantasy, it's mine. But our imaginations are sinful, aren't they? And have you ever noticed just how self-focused our imaginations are? Ever noticed just how self-focused your dreams are flowing out of your imagination? But Jesus never imagined or fantasized about anything sinful or impure. So, Jesus was certainly obedient at the most fundamental level of morality, but every thought, every word, every deed, everything that came out of his nature was fully obedient. Every imagination even that he had was obedient. But let me suggest something else, okay? Jesus' obedience was even greater than all of that. Now you're going, how is that possible? Okay. We think of Jesus' obedience in terms of his performance. We think of his obedience in terms of all of the things that he did or didn't do during the course of his life, even all the various aspects of his nature. But let me suggest to you that Jesus' obedience was because his focus was always on others. His focus was never on himself. His focus was utterly on others. Jesus' overriding holiness was his absolute other-centeredness in every aspect of his life. First and foremost, he kept his eyes fixed on the will of the Father for him, and then he kept his eyes fixed on the mission set before him to save others. Yes, he was obedient in every word, thought, deed. But let me suggest to you that Jesus' real obedience, his greatest obedience, was up here, in that every point of his existence, every reason for his existence as a man, as the God-man, was a focus on others other than him. Focused on his Father's will and on your soul. He wasn't focused on himself. Jesus is often referred to, we think of him as the second Adam or the last Adam or the greater Adam, because Jesus came to be what the first Adam was not. The first Adam was utterly self-centered. Jesus was utterly other-centered in his approach to life, and he was never focused on himself. Let me give you just one example to help understand this. When he went to the cross, what did Jesus own? What did he own? Did he ever own a house? Do we have any reason to believe that he held a mortgage on a house in Capernaum somewhere? Nope. He didn't even own a donkey. He had to borrow one to go into Jerusalem on that first day of the first week before his death, right? He didn't even own a horse. He owned nothing. In fact, when he got to the cross, the only thing he owned, they took from him. They took it from him. And they didn't want to split it, so they cast lots to see who would get it. And Jesus hung on that cross, utterly naked. Now, I know all the pictures that you see hanging of Jesus on a cross have a loincloth, but trust me, he didn't have a loincloth. He hung on that cross, utterly naked, fully exposed in every way, because he was utterly other-centered. Don't miss the contrast there, by the way, folks. What did Adam and Eve do the moment they sinned? They started hiding themselves and covering themselves because their nakedness demonstrated their shame and their guilt. Jesus hung on that cross, naked, bearing fully the shame of our sin that made Adam naked and shamed, and he took that shame on himself by being nailed there naked. You understand what he's doing? He's hanging there with your shame on him, your sin on him, your guilt on him, your narcissism on him, as he takes that for you. For you. Literally, Jesus interposed himself between the devil and his bride. Literally. Jesus stood between the devil and those who would become his bride. Adam didn't. Adam didn't. Adam stood there and watched while the devil attacked his wife. And he let him do it. Jesus didn't. Jesus went and interposed himself with his naked body on a cross between the devil on the one side and his own on the other side, because his focus was not on himself. His focus was on his bride, you and me, as those who belong to him by faith, to protect us as the bride of Christ from wrath, to take dominion over death. He took dominion over death when he walked out of that tomb. He looked back. I can't prove this. But he looked back over his shoulder, walking away from that empty tomb that morning, seeing Satan dancing on the top of that tomb, and he looked back and smiled. Why? Because the devil couldn't hold him anymore. Death had been destroyed. He interposed himself between the devil and the bride of Christ, you and I, by faith, to take dominion over death and to give to his progeny a new focus in life. A new focus. Because where's the focus of the rebellious? On themselves. But where's the focus of those who belong to Christ? Verse 10. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. Why? Because such a person is not spending his whole life doing this. What happens when you walk around with it? Have you ever seen the videos of people walking around looking at their phone and running into things? Have you seen that? It's hilarious, isn't it? But we know it's funny because it's all of us. It's what we do. This is what self-focus does. Self-focus makes us look down like this, and guess what we do? We stumble over things. We run into things. That's what rebellious human beings are doing. They're stumbling around in the dark, staring at themselves. But Jesus Christ has come. Unlike the first Adam that doomed us to that, the second Adam comes and he interposes himself so that you and I can have a very different focus in life. And that focus is not on me or you, it's on others. There's only two types of people that are going to stand before Christ on the judgment day. Only two types of folks. Jesus describes them nicely in Matthew chapter 25, right? Some are called goats and some are called sheep. Just as an aside, I cannot help but think how now the word goat has become such a key word in American society. To be the greatest of all time is to be a goat. I don't want to be a goat, thank you. Jesus describes the goats in that parable as utterly self-focused, doesn't he? You didn't give me water when I was thirsty. You didn't give me clothes when I was needy, when I was naked. You didn't come visit me in the prison. When did we not do that? When you did not do it for the least of my brothers. See? The goats are standing before Christ and they're utterly self-focused. Even as they stand before him, even as they stand and look at him, they're still utterly self-focused. Look, I know I appeal to Matthew 7, 21 to 23 a lot, but look, it's the greatest warning ever in the Scriptures, and you should know it like the back of your hand. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to stand before him. There's going to be a lot of goats standing before Christ on the judgment day, and here's what they're going to do. They're going to call him Lord, and he's going to say, "Get away from me. I never knew you." Why? Why? Because he says also in that passage, "You did not do the will of my Father in heaven." That's the problem. You did all kinds of things, but they were self-focused and self-centered stuff. Religion is the most selfish thing in the world. I want to stand before God and give him a bucket full of the stuff that I've done in my life and assume he's going to accept it. That's the ultimate form of selfishness. The motivation in religion is selfish. The gospel comes selfless. Because what does the narcissistic person have to do to be saved? He has to look away from himself to Christ. You're not going to stand before Christ as a goat. You must stand as a sheep. And the sheep comes and says, I'm looking up from me, and I'm looking to him. I'm not looking at myself anymore. I'm not so concerned about me. I'm not concerned about what I've done or how good I've been. I'm looking to Christ. I'm looking away. This is why the gospel is so hard. It's why the gospel is so difficult for the rebellious to believe, because it requires them to look up from themselves to him and stop looking at themselves. The sheep have learned another focus. They've come to see that only those who look up from their self-centeredness to Christ will be saved. Or, as John describes them, they abide in the light. As those who know Christ, and let me assume for the sake of argument that you do. If you do not know Christ, now's the time to look up. Look up from your screen. Look up from your self-centered focus on yourself. Look up and see Christ. Recognize who you really are. Look to him. Look away from yourself. But for those of us who do know this Christ, we must also extend our obedience to reflect our utter reliance upon the finished work of Christ, something outside of ourselves. We must live in the Spirit by being like Jesus, utterly centered on his priorities and his passions. Not yours, his. You cannot be my disciple without taking up your cross and following me, he says. That's his priorities. Our priorities, gone. His priorities, all that matter. If you're going to call yourself one who walks in light. See what John is saying here? People are walking around in the darkness saying that they have the light, that they're walking in the light. Verse 8, right? Verse 9, he who says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. If your focus is on yourself and you're claiming to be a Christian, you're lying, because it's not true. No, the new commandment is true in him as an utterly self-focused man, and therefore it must also be true in you. Just as Jesus lived utterly focused on his Father and the mission he was given, his people, so we too must live utterly focused on him and by extension upon others. Sacrificing ourselves to his desires. See the word I chose there? Sacrificing. Jesus himself says it this way. John chapter 15. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Notice his focus. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that someone lay down his life for himself. Oh, wait, it doesn't say that, does it? No, lay down his life for his friends. That's the Christian message, my friends. We are called to a focus on him. That is the word of life. That is a new commandment, true in him and true in you.